your comments about combining the conversation about the next several bills because of the subject matter. I think that is our intention. I don't know. Maybe we might have something on one of the other items, but I think we're going to try and focus our conversation on Senate Bill 8 just because it makes sense to do so. And I guess I'll kick it off, and I'm going to focus my comments on the striking workers portion of the bill because, as you mentioned, this is a combination of that legislation as well as the the protections for warehouse workers. So I guess I want to start off by just asking you to maybe tell us a little bit more about the striking workers provisions in the bill. I understand this applies to employers with at least 100 employees, or does it affect other businesses? Or is that only for the warehouse distribution point of the bill?
That would only be for the warehouse distribution portion of the bill. For the striking workers, it would involve any workers engaged in a labor dispute that results in a strike.
So based on that, the size of the company doesn't make any difference?
That is correct.
Okay. We've debated this a number of times in the past, and we even had the distinguished majority leader and Senate president in front of us to debate this topic, and we didn't find a lot of agreement either. I didn't find a lot of agreement with them, and I guess it revolves around our definition of what being unemployed is. The unemployment compensation system exists for people that, according to their own website and the way it's been understood since it's been created, for people that are not working through no fault of their own, people that are capable and able and ready to work, and for people that are actively seeking work. And my objection to this policy all along has been, in part, that the very definition of someone who is on strike is the exact opposite of all three of those requirements. So I guess the first question I would ask through you, Madam Chairman, is if striking workers are voluntarily choosing not to work, how is that the same as being unemployed through no fault of their own?
With this proposed legislation, we would be changing the criteria, and it would be through this legislation that a person would qualify for unemployment if they were on a strike.
But as I just said, unemployment benefits are meant for workers who lose their jobs due to circumstances beyond their control. So how does rewarding people that are actually choosing to strike fit within the original intent of unemployment insurance?
I think through this bill we will be changing how people are eligible to receive unemployment. And I think that in a labor dispute that goes on before longer than 14 days, we are saying as the state of Connecticut that we want to make sure that every employee who's engaged in that strike, every striker, has the ability to exercise their right to strike, that has the ability to exercise their rights under federal law without fear of being starved out. And so we are saying that we're very intentional that this is something that we want our workers in Connecticut to have our back. We want to have their backs, and we want to say that we understand that in certain circumstances where strikes occur, in many circumstances where strikes occur, workers are fighting to protect what they have, to make sure they have health care for their families, to make sure that they have retirement benefits so they can retire with dignity, and that in the state of Connecticut, we're going to ensure that they have the right to exercise their rights under federal law, that they're enabled to do this by having the protection of unemployment during that time after 14 days.
Madam Chairman, so if I hear you correctly, you are very clearly suggesting that you find it acceptable to put weight on the scale for the employees but not the employers, in the sense that you made it very clear. You said that you're fearful that the employees would be starved out. Well, the same thing can happen to the employer. It's happened before. We've had companies across America go out of business because of the demands of organized labor preventing them from continuing in business. They've either made a choice that it's not worth it any longer, or they've suffered to their competition as a result. Why would you justify putting weight on one side of the scale through you?
Obviously, we have a difference of opinion on this. I don't see it as putting a thumb on or weight on one side of the scale. Certainly, there are laws and interpretations of our laws that benefit employers during strikes. Some of them greatly benefit employers during strikes. I think all we're doing here is saying that if workers engage in a strike for more than 14 days, we're going to ensure that they have access to unemployment benefits.
Respectfully, Madam Chairman, you just said that something was opinion when it's clearly not. It's objectively true that this bill puts weight on the scale in benefit of employees. I think you opened your remarks and have repeatedly said all of the benefits that you are trying to guarantee and protect on behalf of employees. To say that that is a matter of opinion is not accurate. It's objectively what this bill does. It says that we are going to say that the employer will effectively have to fund unemployment insurance so that their employees, if they choose to strike, can be compensated during the duration of that. So if businesses must fund unemployment insurance and a strike can disrupt that same business, isn't this policy forcing companies to pay for their own disruptions? I just want to understand how you think that's fair or economically sustainable.
Well, I don't know that. I'm a little surprised you would ask me to explain how something is fair, since we've had that discussion so often that fair is a subjective term. And in fact, we've taken out of titles because you've raised an objection to that use of that word. I believe that this is in the best interest of Connecticut, that we're saying that it is really important that working families in Connecticut have the protections and the rights that are afforded them under federal law, including the right to strike, and including the right to strike and the ability to exercise that right so frequently depends on ability of a person to put food on the table for their family. And ultimately, I believe this is something that truly benefits our state.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. I appreciate your comments. There's a difference certainly between us debating the subject of what's fair from a political debate than from what should be included in the title of a bill. And that's the source of my dispute. I respect you, and I respect your right to your opinion, and I value the conversation. That's why I want your perspective. And I also think it's important for the people watching to hear what you have to say about it. I think it actually benefits me to have folks hear your perspective, which for me, I think is objectively unfair. I think that people who have no dog in the fight, who are neither employers or employees for businesses that are in this situation, would say it's objectively unfair, that you can't be suggesting that we should give benefits paid for by the person that is going to be harmed by those benefits being provided. So how about, you said that this is you think it's best for Connecticut, but my question was about how is this economically viable? And for me, that's what's best for Connecticut, is to make policy in this committee that actually promotes economic growth and therefore job opportunities, higher pay, more opportunities. That's what I'm here for. So I'm trying to understand, wouldn't this policy encourage more frequent and prolonged strikes, since workers would have a financial cushion paid for by taxpayers and businesses? How do you prevent that from being abused?
I have heard actually the opposite argument made. I personally believe it's somewhat neutral on the issue of whether it would be a longer or shorter strike. I think that it really depends on the circumstances. There are those that think it would prevent long strikes because employers would be more incentivized to come to the table and negotiate in good faith. There are also those who argue that it would be prolonged strikes. I think that our interest here is neither. Our interest here is really about ensuring that if people choose to exercise their federal rights to strike, that we're providing unemployment after 14 days so that they have the ability to meet the basic needs of their families. And I think that's almost a neutral position. I know people I agree with on almost everything might disagree with me on this point. They might think it really does incentivize employers more to come to the table. And I know people who disagree with me might say it will prolong a strike. But to me, the issue isn't whether it averts or shortens a strike or prolongs a strike. It's really making sure that people have the ability to exercise their rights.
Thank you for that answer, Madam Chairman. Again, you've repeated a number of times about making sure people have their right to strike. This bill does nothing to change that. They have a right already. It's established in federal legislation, as you've already described. I'm very much in favor of it. I think the people around the table in both parties also are in favor of it. We're not trying to prevent anyone from collectively bargaining. We're not trying to get people not to strike. What we're saying is, if people can strike and businesses can negotiate their terms on the other side of the equation, then why is it the business of the state of Connecticut to jump in there and interfere? I mean, you've mentioned over and over again that employees need health care, they need to feed their families. I agree. I don't want to see anybody disrupted or lose out. But you're negating the fact that employers have families and need health care and need to feed themselves. I think there's this perception that somehow the employer, whether it's a single individual, but more often than not in these particular cases, the employer is, maybe a corporation that might be shareholders involved, things like that. I mean, the fact of the matter is that those folks also have an investment, and they're forced by our current circumstances to come to the table for collective bargaining negotiations. And the employees already, in my view, have a tremendous amount of strength because of their ability to collectively bargain. One employee going to an employer and saying, I demand X, Y, and Z has a much harder time because the employer may be able to find someone who's willing to replace them. Collective bargaining already provides a tremendous advantage for employees because they actually can hold over the success and further operations of the company itself to operate. I think that is an amazing amount of power, to be able to dictate to an employer that they may or may not continue operating their business. And so you're talking about adding to that already what I consider to be significant advantage in power by saying that not only are we going to encourage collective bargaining and the ability for employees to strike as a result of a failed negotiation, but now you want to pay them out of the proceeds of the employer's profits and also from taxpayers so that they can continue to strike for a longer period. And whether you say on the record that you think this will lead to shorter periods than not, that's not what the bill does. The bill allows people to strike beyond the normal time frame because they're going to be compensated. I think it's almost a specious argument to suggest that somehow the bill would result in shorter strikes. The only way that happens is if the employer is threatened so significantly by the fact that their employees will be able to be paid and compensated for striking that they feel not incentivized, which is the word you used, but bullied or extorted into having to settle prematurely because it's no longer a fair negotiation. It's kind of like, watching a boxing match where it's 2 against 1 now, because now it's not just the employer versus the employees in the negotiation. It is now the state intervening and providing additional benefits so that the one boxer in the fight gets extra protections or has a different set of rules to play by. I'm very much in favor of freedom and fairness, and I believe that our state legislature has a compelling interest not to be involved in cases where we are taking sides. And I understand there's folks that are interested in this bill because they think that they want to advance the cause of employees versus employers. And I just, I struggle with this all the time in this committee, and I bring it up almost every year. And that is that, I don't know why these relationships are ever antagonistic relationships. Every experience I've ever had as an employer or as an employee was in concert with the other party, where we recognized that we had to work together for our mutual success. And employers that I've worked for largely have benefited me when I did my best to work for the company and help improve, our bottom line. Most employers I know want the best employees they can get. The fact of the matter is it's harder and harder these days to find quality employees. I just don't see this as fair. So if the goal is to help workers negotiate better wages and benefits, isn't there a concern here that employers now have a stronger, as you use the word, incentive? I don't think they have an incentive to necessarily settle a strike sooner. I think they have an incentive to automate or to relocate to another jurisdiction where they don't have this law. I mean, if I own a company in Connecticut and this passes into law, and I know that my company is going to automatically become less profitable because now you have created a situation where the employees can force the employer into greater benefits and pay. Now, isn't it likely that those employers are going to seek greener pastures? They're going to go to another state or another country where this doesn't happen. We've witnessed this over time. We have this conversation here all the time about how the state's losing businesses, how the country has been losing manufacturing to overseas, for years because they don't have the same requirements. Well, you're creating that exact incentive for businesses to leave. So how do you respond to that risk that you're creating an incentive for businesses to relocate to avoid this policy if it's passed just in Connecticut? Through you.
So I think you're aware that this law exists in both New York and New Jersey. And actually, in New York, there has been payment of unemployment for striking workers for many, many decades. When I started working there in 1977, there was unemployment for striking workers in New York, even back then. It has been improved over the years, so you had to be out longer in the past, but now it's the 14 days that we're proposing here. And in all of that time, I've never heard an employer make the claim that they were moving out of New York because they had unemployment benefits for striking workers. I know that in both New York and New Jersey, we have not heard that as one of the arguments that has come up, that employers are leaving those states. And I believe if they were, and if they were saying that publicly, we certainly would have had testimony to that.
Thank you for that answer, Madam Chairman. But clearly, New Jersey and New York are not the entire realm of opportunity for employers to relocate. And whether there was actual testimony or not, I don't think diminishes my point or its objective truth that when you create any sort of economic incentive, people follow the money. That's what happens. Arguing that, just because it wasn't brought up, it's not true. It's clearly true. Just like employees are going to go to companies that offer greater wages and benefits, employers are going to look for places where they can make more profit. It's just a matter of fact in life. And to suggest otherwise, it's just, arguing against reality. And I shouldn't be surprised because we do a lot of that in this committee. We argue directly against what is economic reality that slaps the state of Connecticut in the face over and over again. The fact of the matter is that, people in Connecticut are struggling. They're having a tough time paying their bills. Affordability is a huge issue. Electric rates. And I'm not seeing any action by the majority to address those problems. And what I do see is a bill that is going to ask people who are not in a union and taxpayers who have no stake in a strike on either side. They're not, working, as owners in a company, and they're not employees in the company. But now they're going to be required under this legislation to help fund unemployment compensation insurance. So please explain to me, Madam Chairman, how we justify that people that are not directly involved, who are already struggling to pay their bills based on the lack of action from the majority, why should they have to put money into this through you?
Well, first of all, in the states that have unemployment benefits for striking workers, we have not seen where it has had any major impact on the solvency of the unemployment trust funds. And so I'm not certain how taxpayers might be involved. We do know that, in fact, it would hit the employer whose workers are on strike in terms of their rating. So I do understand that piece at all. But I mean, you might want to explain a little more about how you see taxpayers being, who have nothing to do with the situation being impacted.
Well, taxpayers fund everything. I mean, the fact of the matter is, if a company is forced with higher unemployment insurance premiums, that gets passed on in the cost of their products. And therefore, people across our state are going to end up paying more for those goods and services. And of course, they're going to be taxed more at the same time. And unemployment compensation insurance in Connecticut is one of the highest. I don't know. I should have brought those statistics with me. I think we have record-breaking premiums that are out of control, and they're punishing employers currently. This is only going to make that situation worse. And there's many businesses that are currently struggling. They're struggling to find good and quality employees, but they're also struggling under the cost of inflation. They're struggling under labor costs, which I think are largely exacerbated by the minimum wage laws that we have in the state of Connecticut. I'm talking about restaurants, for example, or coffee shops. People that work in assisted living facilities, things like that. I mean, those folks, are now being compensated at rates that are unprecedented in those industries, and basically making it difficult for those businesses to survive. So where does this end? I guess is my next question. So if we're going to start offering unemployment insurance to people who are voluntarily not working because they're going on strike, that's a choice. Hey, let me ask you that question. Would you, like Senator Looney, would you argue with me that it's a choice to go on strike?
Well, I want to go back to something you said about the impact of the minimum wage on restaurants and coffee shops, because I've been having this conversation a lot lately with folks from that industry. And, of all the industries in the state of Connecticut, the industry that has been least impacted by the increase in the minimum wage is the restaurant industry. 40% of their workers have not had a raise in the minimum salary that we require as a state since, I'm not exactly sure whether it was before I got here, so it was either 2017, 2016. It used to be tied to the minimum wage. It used to go up with the minimum wage. Every time the minimum wage went up, the tipped wage credit was impacted. But we changed that in 2019. So 40% of the labor costs have not moved for restaurants in all these years. So I'm always a little surprised when that's used as an example of how the impact of the minimum wage by people who are opposed to increasing the minimum wage, how it's used as an example. To me, also raising the minimum wage here is a really great example of how we in the legislature have made a huge impact on Connecticut's working families. We know that personal income tax in our state is up. We know that the employee cost index is up because people are getting raises. And so for me, the argument about how this impacts taxpayers, and I appreciate that you clarified, you're really talking about consumers when you say that a consumer would have a price increase and then they would pay more taxes because they pay sales tax. I mean, I assume that's the argument you're making. It's a pretty remarkable it's a pretty remarkable argument to me because, first of all, we've had so few strikes in the state of Connecticut that have lasted longer than 14 days. Really, it's been a handful. And in many cases, it isn't affecting very many workers. Those workers are deeply impacted, and it would make a huge difference if they could, to them, if they had unemployment benefits after 14 days. But I don't see where it's really going to make that kind of impact you're discussing on taxpayers of the state of Connecticut. I don't think there's evidence that that will be the case. I think there are other arguments you can make that, you know, are legitimate arguments, but I just don't think this is going to negatively impact taxpayers in the state of Connecticut. I'm sorry, I forgot your original question. I got distracted by all the things you'd been saying. Sometimes I do get to respond to the other things you say. Your final question was, where is this leading to? I think where it's leading to, that's a fairly easy question to answer, because to me, this is leading to a state that really, us to be a state that really understands that workers, when they go out on strike, I haven't heard of any strikes recently. I haven't really, in my time, engaged anyone, seen anyone in a strike that was going out on strike over something frivolous. It was always something extremely meaningful. I think the biggest strike we've had in recent years in Connecticut was the Stop and Shop strike. And these workers were striking over the ability to keep their family health care. That has a huge impact on our state. If they had lost family health care, how many more families would be struggling to make ends meet? Because there are a lot of people employed in Stop and Shop throughout the state of Connecticut. How many more people would not have had family health care, would not have been able to pay their rent, pay their bills because they lost their family health care? So, you know, that's probably the biggest strike we've had in Connecticut. And we were very fortunate. It did not go on beyond the 14 days. I believe it was only 11 days. And I think that people in Connecticut stood with those Stop and Shop workers in a way that really was impressive, because there were virtually no customers in Stop and Shop during that strike. And it was right during Easter and Passover when a lot of people would have been shopping there. I don't think that, I think people understood the need to stand with those workers to protect their health care. And I think that in most cases when workers go out on strike, it's not an easy decision they make, and it's one that they make usually because it's critical to taking steps to protecting their families. So I think this particular bill and this movement will put Connecticut in a place where we really demonstrate that we want workers to be able to exercise their rights under federal law, with the understanding that should it go on for more than 14 days, that unemployment will help them meet their, you know, most basic needs. I'm finished, yes. Senator Sampson.
Thank you very much, Madam
And we are
Chair.
very polite in this committee. I appreciate that.
Oh, yes, yes. I'm just trying to wait to be recognized before I start speaking.
No, I appreciate that.
I would not want to cut you off. So I appreciate your comments. I've tried, during this debate to stick to the bill that is before us. My comments regarding the minimum wage were directly related to the impact on the policies passed out of this committee and this legislature, and their impact on employees and employers in the state of Connecticut. I'll just reiterate my response that you asked about previous to this question. It's not just about the taxes that folks have to pay. It's also about the cost of goods and services. That's why I was suggesting, I referred to people across Connecticut as taxpayers, but they're also consumers, and they are going to end up paying for this as consumers as well as taxpayers. That's the larger response to that question. It's not merely that they're paying more tax; it's that they have to pay more for goods and services. And since you brought up the minimum wage, I just want to clarify a couple things. First and foremost, restaurants are required to pay the entire minimum wage. Don't forget that. I think that was lost in your response to kind of suggest that somehow because the tip wage exists, they're being compensated at less than the minimum wage. But that's not the law in Connecticut. They get the full minimum wage. So as the minimum wage has gone up, restaurants have been impacted as well. And as far as the minimum wage being such a benefit to the people of Connecticut, I'm just shocked by I don't know what other word to use. I don't want to be rude, but I would just call it hubris to suggest that somehow the people that supported the minimum wage increase in the state of Connecticut, and this committee in particular, to take credit for those raises. You know, this committee didn't give anybody any raises. The law didn't give anyone a raise. Those employers did. And they may have been compelled by statute to pay a higher minimum wage, but that didn't give anyone a raise. What gave people a raise is that employers were forced by the state to adapt to a new set of rules. So they did. What a minimum wage does is it eliminates jobs below that. That's what it actually effectively does. So if you have a minimum wage, I don't know where it is now, 16 something, but if you have a job that pays $12 an hour, that law erased that job. Doesn't exist anymore. That opportunity for the employer and employee in that case is eliminated, completely wiped from the face of the earth. Now, some people that were making less did end up with a higher paying job in accordance with the new minimum wage requirement, but it's not the same job anymore. The employer had to adapt. Employers went from having 10 employees to 8 employees. They paid a little bit more, but so did their responsibilities change. So the legislature, and no individual legislator should be taking credit for giving anyone a raise. They simply created an impediment to production by suggesting that certain jobs can no longer exist, even if there are willing participants. You know, my role in this committee I see as the defender of the freedom of the people of Connecticut, whether they're employers or employees, to engage in free commerce and make their own choices about the business decisions that they make and what things they engage in, what jobs they take, what people they hire. And we're forever, as a legislature, as a government, interfering with that. And I'll just point out, by the way, that every little last bit of interference from this bill requiring the employers to actually fund the people that are going on strike from their company, which is completely absurd and madness in my view, to increasing the minimum wage or putting all kinds of other requirements in the way of employers and employees interfering with what can appear in a contract, an NDA, et cetera, or non-compete agreement. All those things interfere with freedom. And freedom is the mechanism, the driver of our economy, the ability for people to engage in commerce because they choose to. That's what makes our country work. That's what gives us the quality of life that we have. And interfering with that just eliminates jobs, eliminates opportunities, forces people to look elsewhere. All of those things are damaging to our economy, and they're ultimately damaging to the people that you suggest you're helping. Because if there are more employers and more commerce and more opportunities, that raises the quality of life, that raises wages, it raises everything. These policies that harm freedom and opportunity ultimately mean we produce less, and there are less quality goods in this world, and quality jobs. My question, before we got off on our aside about debating the advantages and disadvantages of a significant minimum wage, was if we start giving unemployment benefits to people who voluntarily leave their jobs, as this bill suggests, what stops us from extending it to anyone who quits their job? Why is it just people who are in a union that are collectively bargaining? How come they are the ones that can quit their job and still get unemployment? What about other people who just quit because they're unhappy? Are you going to extend it to them as well?
I will answer that question, but I do want to first comment on a couple of things that you said. I do agree with you. We actually agree on something, Senator Sampson. I agree with you that no individual legislator gave an increase to those who are making the minimum wage in 2019. And since then, we did it as a legislature when we voted to compel employers to raise the minimum wage. And we didn't do it by ourselves. We had tremendous support from the people who, in fact, were earning minimum wage and had been stuck there for so many years. And I have to say, when I talk to folks, that is one thing, that and the paid family medical leave, those two things come up so frequently from constituents who have benefited from the things we've done as a legislature. So I'm not taking credit for giving people a raise, and I don't think any individual here should take that credit, because it was really came from the grassroots of the workers themselves, and it came from us doing something very responsible, I think, as a legislature. One other thing I want to comment on is the idea that, yes, under law, employers in the restaurant business where there's a tipped worker have to make up the difference if they don't earn the minimum wage. But I still think it's really hard for people to argue that it's costing restaurants when restaurants have come here and testified that workers are earning so much above the minimum wage, that the tip credit through their tips, that we don't even have to discuss the tip credit. So my point was that restaurants haven't seen an increase out of their pockets, out of the employer's pocket, for many, many years, for 40% of their workforce, if in fact what they're saying is true, that their workers are making so much more than the minimum wage. So I certainly, I stand by the comment that I made earlier, and we might disagree on that, but I felt it was worth mentioning. As to the question of what stops us from coming back and saying that any worker who quits their job is entitled to unemployment, if that was the will of the legislature, I assume we could do that. But to argue this is a slippery slope, that we're going to start paying unemployment to every worker who quits their job, I think is, I'm not sure that's a real serious argument. Thank you. Senator Sampson.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Just with regard to this thing you want to keep going back to about the restaurants, and the fact of the matter is that we live in an interconnected economy, and restaurants are faced with rising costs because of lots of factors. Energy rates that the majority continues to ignore is one of those things, but labor rates, generally speaking, and everybody involved in a restaurant and their entire production line, the food that they have to purchase that is actually being farmed and delivered, the truck driver that brings it, the guy that picks the lettuce, the guy that packages the meat, all of them along the way are being compensated more based on the rising costs that you're creating in the labor industry through inflation and artificial government interference. All of those things drive up costs. That's the answer to that question, is that we live in an interconnected economy. It's not just simply one tiny box to look at. We have to look at how the economies work in scale, which is why I asked all these other questions about, you can suggest, oh, well, in New York, there's no evidence that the companies are relocating. Oh, there is. Just because we don't have the evidence to discuss right here, it's obvious. Companies have been fleeing to other countries. Why is everything made in China? I mean, that's the answer to the question. It's because the labor costs are less, among other things. And when you continue to put more impediments on goods and services being produced in the United States, or in Connecticut in particular, I think it's a lot easier for somebody to move to a neighboring state than it is for them to move to China for their manufacturing facility. So you're putting an even greater pressure and more risk on Connecticut employers, and therefore you're potentially harming their employees, because when those companies leave, those folks are going to have to leave also to follow those jobs, or they're going to be seeking other jobs that'll be harder to get. And when there's more workers out there than there are jobs, you know what that does? That drives down the labor rate. So for people well above the minimum wage, I don't see how any of this helps. And I think if people actually take a step back and stop looking at just the immediate circumstances and recognize how this intersects with the rest of our global economy, where there's competition going on state to state, town to town, business to business, and across the world, then they're going to recognize that these things are dangerous. You can't just keep making policy after policy because it feels good, or because your base is union labor. You can't do that. It's not good policy. Good policy is the job of this legislature. And I'm convinced, Madam Chairman, that this policy is going to make Connecticut a worse place to do business, something we already have the title of, being the worst place to do business in the whole country. It's going to drive companies to relocate to states or countries with fewer labor disruptions. This is going to incentivize unions to weaponize strikes against employers. You said it yourself. You said that this is going to prevent, there's going to be less strikes because employers are going to be incentivized to settle. Well, maybe that's true, but is that a good thing? Is that, that we should be empowering one side of the equation? Imagine if somebody came along and said, we're going to empower the employer to say, how about a law that says if someone goes on strike, then when they come back after the strike, their pay is reduced 5%? Would that be crazy? That would be crazy, right? And everyone knows that would be crazy. But that's what's going on here. You're effectively doing the same thing in reverse. You're telling the employer, well, you're going to have to pay more when the employees go on strike. You're asking the very people that are providing the jobs to fund people who are going to voluntarily leave work and help them have a stronger position to negotiate. If strikes are necessary to improve wages and benefits, but you add government money to reduce the pain of striking, doesn't that undermine the very purpose of the strike? It doesn't make any economic sense. You're emboldening unions to actually strike more often or to threaten strikes more often to put employers over a barrel in more cases. And anyone else listening, by the way, besides employers and employees, should recognize all of this means that everything you buy is going to cost more. That's the untold bottom line truth about all of this policy. Again, this bill is just this piece, but also it includes the warehouse worker policy that I can't get into. Unfortunately, the way this place works, I am in 3 places at once, and I'm supposed to be debating 35 bills in the Housing Committee right now, and there's a very controversial bill actually being debated over there. And I am very frustrated that I'm forced in a position to have to choose which bills to debate at any given time in each committee. So I'm going to wrap up my remarks on Senate Bill 8 and just state that this is just the beginning of my questions. And if this bill makes it to the floor of the Senate, I can promise you a very lengthy debate, because we should get into this policy in a very significant way. This is not a small change to our existing laws. This is something that is going to have lasting effects. This is something that is going to have a lasting impression on Connecticut as far as not just our immediate economic circumstances, but the way we're viewed by employers across this country, especially large employers that are having to make decisions about where to locate their facilities. If I'm a company and I'm looking at where do we have opportunities to place our next facility, I really got to tell you, this is the kind of thing that's going to say, well, Connecticut's off the list. And any suggestion that that's not true is absurd in my mind. That is absolutely happening. And if we grab some of those major employers that are national or even international and ask them, they're going to tell you exactly that. They're going to say, no, we don't even think about Connecticut. So how many lost opportunities have already existed for our state because these major employers that could have offered tremendous job opportunities and high-paying jobs to people are gone? They're happening in some other place because the Connecticut legislature and the majority has said, no, we're going to play so many games that those people are not going to come here. This is a bad policy, Madam Chairman. I'll be a no today. Thank you.